Duncan Forrester once claimed that theologians have a special responsibility in the political sphere of today because they are, and I quote, peculiarly qualified to enter sympathetically and with understanding into conversations with other believers. Taking this as my starting point, I will try to articulate a critique of Forrester's notion of the fragment. We touched on that in a question yesterday, so happily today we'll get to discuss it some more. And the related idea that certain insights that are in fact theological can be understood intuitively by a non-religious public. The fragment plays an important role in Duncan Forrester's conception of the political role of theology. He claimed that the human condition is necessarily fragmented, seeing as we in our sinful condition never can achieve more than fragmented knowledge amidst the complexities and ambiguities of our existence. Moreover, he thought that we lived in fragmented times when the reasoning and morality of coherent communities and grand narratives no longer seem viable in public. Forrester also seemed to harbor a suspicion that coherent systems often become totalizing and, in that sense, authoritarian and potentially epistemologically violent. The fragment, however, is also Forrester's solution to all this. The fragment is the mode of contribution that remains for theology in such a situation. It preserves the humbleness that stands in contrast to totalizing ambitions and the hubris contained in the notion that we as humans have access to the entire reality. Forrester contended that fragments of theological and religious insight can be offered in public and be recognized by people in general as true, even though they don't belong to the tradition or community where the fragment is part of a larger systematic whole. The fragment, according to Forrester, can thus lay claim to be public truth, or at least contribute to common reflection in public. These fragments can take the form of questions or challenges that illuminate an issue. They can contribute particular insights or perspective, offer clues, remainders, and qualifications. So it's for the churches and theologians to struggle to rediscover the position of creative minority and try to articulate such fragments that can be constructively deployed for the good of society as a whole. And the public will understand these fragments intuitively, it seems. So, however, this might not be such a straightforward affair, and I would like to pause at this juncture and ask what makes the fragments intuitively understandable? What makes them recognizable as true? While Forrester believed that political theology should expose the inadequacy of the conventional wisdom of the age, he simultaneously realized that Christian tradition had penetrated deeply into Western thought and culture and shaped the Western understanding of notions such as justice. Still, Forrester believed that precisely the parts of Christian tradition that lie outside public consensus, the ones that modify or enlarge conventional understanding, are the important contributions of Christian theology. So, according to him, there's not an identity between Christian and Western traditions, but still a certain resonance. So there is a possibility that the efficacy of the fragment as a form for theology and religious ethics to contribute to public debate relies precisely on such shared understanding and cultural background. The plausibility of a theological fragment might not be a function of how true it is or how much potential it has to bring new perspectives to political matters. Rather, the inverse might be true. We could be considerably more prone to recognize as true something which is vaguely familiar and therefore seems reasonable. One could also question if the fragments of Christian tradition in and of themselves can communicate all the content that Forrester envisioned, if they were truly separated from the framework of narrative and doctrine which made them meaningful. Rather, the idea of the fragment as the way for religious thought to get heard in public debate relies on the public being post-Christian rather than secular. And the resonance in culture could be thus both what makes the fragments believable and what gives them substantial content. So the problem with this, of course, is that there are other religious traditions in our public too, such as Islam. And by virtue of the same reasons that we deem it fair that Christian contributions be heard in public, others should be allowed to enter the conversation also. It is a matter of religious freedom and of the quality of democratic culture. It is also about listening to the voices of those most likely to be silenced, because they are the most likely to have something to add. It is about admitting that many traditions are rich sources of insight whose valuable contributions should not go unheard. And if we rely on intuitive understanding, we risk privileging fragments with resonance in the dominant culture, to the detriment of insights from other religious traditions. But if shared background is necessary in order for fragments of theology to achieve the resonance that lend them plausibility, perhaps European politics should be built on Christian insights alone. To the contrary, I would claim that background knowledge can be built. I believe that this is the experience of social movements generally, that slowly, painfully, and gradually, sensibilities and intuitions can be made to shift. The public can be made to see and recognize a context that ultimately results in the arguments from a certain community becoming plausible. I believe that that is a better description of, for example, the social struggle for gay marriage, even if it, in a way, seemed to involve an almost instantaneous illumination of most of the Western public. What we need, then, is perhaps not fragments, but contexts. We need public fora that are hospitable to many different traditions, and we need democratic practices that lets us understand each other across traditions and lets different religious arguments contribute to dialogue. But then contexts, rather than fragments, must be communicated. If we are to understand each other's arguments across traditions, the context of narratives, interpretations, beliefs, and practices that make these arguments important, plausible, and coherent must also be communicated in public. As philosopher Jeffrey Stout has remarked, theology might not be rational, but theology is a context within which rational reasoning can be undertaken. And in order for the contributions of other traditions to be heard as intuitive fragments of truth and not simply detached and unreasonable claims, we must do the hard work of getting to know each other's traditions, the horizons of interpretation and understanding that they entail. Such an effort can be articulated with the help of Jeffrey Stout's notion of deepened democratic culture, and I hope that my research into the methods and interpretation of Islamic and Christian social ethics is part of that project. As Stout has argued in response to secularist assumptions among political philosophers, democratic culture should involve that we argue from our convictions, are prepared to defend them against critique, to justify and explain them in terms of the commitments and fundamental beliefs on which they rest, and assume responsibility for their consequences. We should be prepared to listen to others, to their beliefs, reasons, and propositions, and to subject them to critique in turn. This democratic activity should be fair-minded and non-manipulative. It should not, however, be restricted in advance by rules about religious or secular language or about presuppositions of reasonability and secular normativity. Rather, both respect and the goal of understanding demands that we actually state the real reasons we have for our positions, be they religious or otherwise. And while this picture of Stout of democratic culture is compelling, I think, it does not in itself address the fact that who gets a hearing at all, who is assumed to be reasonable and rational, is structured at the outset of conversation by norms of power that are often fundamentally racist. This is where I would like to come back to Forrester's idea about the responsibility of peculiarly qualified religious people to enter into conversations that are, I quote, attentive, serious, engaging with the subtext as well as the text, attempting strenuously to understand the other, unquote. Western Christianity is in a remarkably privileged position in Europe today, and this, I believe, underscores the responsibility articulated by Forrester. European Christians can all too easily escape such critique as is directed toward other religious traditions that are painted as violent and irrational. and instead project their Christian tradition as the reasonable and rational one. Christianity is thus rendered non-threatening to both secular sensibilities and national chauvinist projects. But Christians could choose another road, and they should choose to be part of a political conversation that makes comprehensible and accessible the context of a multitude of different religious reasons. By entering democratic conversations with the religious peoples and theologies of other traditions, Christians can act in solidarity and use their peculiarly qualified positions to validate the reasonability and contributions of other traditions than the dominant. Such solidarity not only promotes democratic culture and is hospitable to enriching insights from other traditions, but importantly, it secures rather than endangers our faithfulness to our own tradition. Thank you.